Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for joining us at the investiture of Professor Jason Mazzone as the Albert E. Jenner Jr. Professor of Law. I am very pleased, though not surprised, to see so many friends, colleagues, and students here to celebrate this significant occasion in Jason's remarkable career. The investiture is a lovely and long-standing tradition in academia that is intended to acknowledge and honor faculty members who, over the course of their careers, have shown exemplary achievement in their scholarship, teaching, and public engagement. It marks the highest levels of academic accomplishment, stature, and impact. In addition to providing a fitting means to celebrate an honoree, an investiture also offers a chance to honor and thank donors whose vision and generosity make academic excellence possible. The Jenner Professorship, in particular, derives from a very generous estate gift from the late Albert E. Jenner, one of our most illustrious alumni. Mr. Jenner graduated from the College of Law in 1930 and joined the firm that was later to bear his name, Jenner & Block. By the early 1940s, Burt Jenner was known as an extremely able trial lawyer, and by the 1960s, he was a nationally and internationally recognized lawyer and statesperson. In 1951, President Truman appointed him to serve on the National United States Loyalty Review Board. He also later served as senior counsel to the famous Warren Commission that investigated the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And he was a member of President Lyndon Johnson's Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence, formed after the murders of Dr. Martin Luther King and JFK's younger brother, Senator Bobby Kennedy. He then later still served as Chief Special Counsel to the United States House of Representatives Committee on the Judiciary in the impeachment proceedings of former President Richard M. Nixon. He argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. He served on the boards of publicly held corporations. He was really a true superstar. He also did a lot for the university and the college. He was a member of the University of Illinois Foundation and served as chairman of the College of Law's first capital campaign. He received the Distinguished Alumni Award in 1962 and was awarded an honorary doctorate in 1981. Our venerable law library, of course, bears his name, as does the firm, Jenner & Block, which continues to be one of the great law firms in the country, based in Chicago, but with offices and influence throughout the world. I think of Burt Jenner probably more days than not when I walk in the building. I always enjoy visiting Jenner & Block and seeing all of his memorabilia, seeing notes from the Warren Commission and the like, and we are very grateful to all that he's done, and I want to acknowledge that. Today we're joined by another distinguished leader of the University of Illinois, and that's Dr. Kevin Pitt, Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and a professor on our physics faculty. As a Vice Provost, Dr. Pitt provides campus-wide leadership, setting strategic directions for the undergraduate experience at Illinois, supporting innovation in classroom and online instruction, and encouraging interdisciplinary activities and initiatives in curricular innovation. Collaborating with colleges, schools, and other stakeholders, he works to ensure that the undergraduate experience at Illinois, which is important not just to the undergrads but to all of us, continues to be one of the best in the nation, and he's representing Central Campus today, and he's going to offer a few remarks, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Pitt.
Thank you, Dean Amar, and thank you all for joining us to celebrate the accomplishments and achievements of Dr. Jason Mazzone with his investiture as the Albert E. Jenner Jr. Professor of Law. I offer congratulations on behalf of the campus leadership and as a representative of Interim Provost John Wilkin. I consider it a real privilege to be a part of investiture ceremonies. The support of chairs, professorships, and fellowships are the most visible examples of the impact of private investment in the public university. These gifts are literally investments in people, in ideas, and in human potential, and we are so grateful for individuals who believe in Illinois and in our faculty members. I think it's really important to remember what a distinction it is to earn this kind of honor at the University of Illinois. This is a campus with an international reputation for outstanding research, teaching, and scholarship among all of our faculty. Usually during this portion of the investiture, I say something along the lines of many days as a professor and researcher include careful and intense work that happens behind closed doors. I'm not sure that exactly applies to Professor Mazzone. After all, he's been extremely successful in translating his work for public use and has made a career of using his scholarship to interact with the world. So in this case, I think it's more appropriate to say today that we are celebrating the work that we see him accomplishing. At Illinois, we like to say that our faculty are changing the world. With Professor Mazzone, this is especially true. His work has influenced how we view the Constitution of the United States. He has also worked around the world, advising new democracies during their process of drafting and implementing their own constitutions, which is truly astounding. He's also an expert in intellectual property law. I'm sure that many of you know this, but it's worth repeating. Professor Mazzone actually invented a term. It's copy fraud, which describes claims of copyright in works that are in the public domain. It's not very often that we get to say our law professors are inventors, but in this case, it's certainly true. Professor Mazzone understands the importance of research and scholarship with an end goal in mind. He's not satisfied with studying and researching to merely publish in academic journals. He's interested in discovery that can be used to impact society, whether it's through acting as a jurist or as an advisor or pro bono litigant or author. He has 2 books in the works. Dr. Mazzone acts as an ambassador for Illinois, spreading his expertise. His work is helping us understand the past and shape the future. When the Illinois founders envisioned professors who could act as beacons of knowledge for the public good, they envisioned individuals like Dr. Mazzone. We are grateful to celebrate his career today at Illinois, and we look forward to further nurturing his work. Congratulations, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And now let me say a few more words about my friend, my colleague, my sometimes teacher, Jason Mazzone. Jason holds degrees from what some might consider the higher education trifecta, Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, including law degrees from both Harvard, where he got his JD, and Yale, where he earned his LLM and SJD. I mentioned President Kennedy earlier. I think one of JFK's quips applies with particular force to Jason's legal pedigree. John Kennedy had dyed-in-the-wool Harvard man upon receiving an honorary degree at Yale when he was president, said that now he had the best of both worlds, a Yale degree but a Harvard education. While a student at Harvard, Jason worked with Lawrence Tribe on constitutional cases in the Supreme Court, and he also did work for Robert Putnam, a sociologist at Harvard who has written a number of influential books, including the one that Jason helped him work on, the best-selling Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community. Jason clerked at both the United States District Court and the United States Court of Appeals levels in New York before practicing intellectual property law there. Kevin mentioned his intellectual property copyright prowess. He joined the College of Law faculty here in 2012, having been a tenured professor at Brooklyn Law School before that. Since coming here, Jason has helped anchor our constitutional law faculty, and both his teaching and scholarship have left an indelible mark on this institution and its people. He is the director of our program in constitutional theory, history, and law. And before my deanship ends, I'm going to maybe suggest reordering that so that law isn't third in the sequence. While Jason has written extensively about individual rights, and such as First Amendment rights, and indeed has written about copyright, his recent and ongoing scholarship tends to focus on issues of constitutional structure and institutional design, such as federalism and separation of powers, both in domestic and comparative realms, and in particular, how those designs and structures interact with the development and protection of individual rights. In addition to his many influential journal articles, some of which are on display on the table outside, he is currently at work on 2 books that Dr. Pitts adverted to. One, a global study on the future of constitutional rights, and another, an inquiry into how the Constitution serves to both unify and divide the United States at once. He's an elected member of the American Law Institute and a fellow of the European Law Institute, chair of the Illinois Bologna Conference on Comparative Constitutional Law, member of the advisory board of the Italian Law Journal, and a member of the International Association of Constitutional Law Research Group on Constitutionalism in Illiberal Democracies. His scholarship has been cited by many courts, including the United States Supreme Court. His writing and his teaching are exceptionally highly regarded by his academic consumers. His colleagues here and around the country speak of his writings in glowing terms. One said, quote, "Jason is one of a handful of the most important and one of the most thoughtful and discerning constitutional scholars of his generation." Another added, quote, "He is one of our nation's most truly creative and independent constitutionalists. For many leaders in constitutional law, I can predict what their take is likely to be on a given subject before I read it. Jason is an inspiring and refreshing exception. His work cannot be ideologically pigeonholed and demonstrates a commitment to scholarship in the highest sense, a willingness to go where logic and evidence lead." Another said, quote, "He is precisely the type of scholar a university should honor, wide-ranging, eclectic, with a great deal of peripheral vision and pluralist tastes in scholarship." One particular aspect of Jason's contributions that was mentioned, and I think that really sets him apart from most of his highly performing peers in the field, is his independence of mind. At a time when so many constitutional scholars preach only to the converted and espouse legal views that sometimes fluctuate depending on which party or persons occupy the White House, Congress, or state houses, it's inspiring to see people like Jason who not only believe in but who live the idea that constitutional principles can and do transcend partisan politics, and that law is a meaningful and coherent realm of inquiry in which we can have some faith, even at a time when trust in American institutions seems to be at a modern nadir. His passion and expertise are as apparent in the classroom as in his scholarship. His students say he's, quote, "a dazzling professor with immense knowledge," that he possesses, quote, "an unbelievable breadth of understanding of constitutional law," and that he is, quote, "an excellent communicator and always entertaining." One summed him up by saying, "brilliant, funny, and always on time, a gentleman and a scholar." Another advised me, I suppose, give him more money, responsibilities, and job security. Now, I will tell you that he has job security. I'm always looking to pile more duties onto his plate. And as to the money, well, as the singer Meatloaf said, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. A generous colleague, a creative, influential, and intellectually honest scholar, a lively and imaginative teacher, Jason, it is my privilege and pleasure today to recognize your many accomplishments and confer on you this honor you have most assuredly earned. So if you'll stand, I will present you with the medallion. Give over your glasses. There we go. And Mike wants a picture. Thank you. And now educate us.
Well, thank you so much. I barely recognize myself from those comments. Thank you, Dean Amar and Vice Provost Pitts, for joining us today. Thank you all for coming. I'm sure you have better things to do, so I'm glad that you're here. It's customary to make some remarks at this point, and I want to talk then about constitutions, and along the way say something also about Bert Jenner. And I'd like to organize my remarks around two concepts, 2 ideas, and distinguish between the 2 of them. See if this thing's working. Yeah, this is my first PowerPoint presentation too. So 2 concepts. One is constitutional crisis, the other is crisis of constitutionalism. And I want to say some things about each. But let's start with constitutional crisis. This is a term that is used very frequently today, and there was an uptick in the use of the term since the death of Justice Antonin Scalia in February of 2016. You might remember that right after Scalia died, Senate Republicans announced that they would not consider any nominee to the Supreme Court from President Barack Obama, that instead the choice of the next nominee to the Supreme Court, the choice of the next justice, should be made by the winner of the November presidential election. This is quite unusual to take the position that it doesn't matter who you nominate President Obama, we in the Senate will not consider anybody from you. And various commentators said, we're facing a constitutional crisis. Right, as a result of this stance, those claims intensified when Obama, as you know, nominated Merrick Garland, Chief Judge of the D.C. Circuit, to the Scalia seat, and the Senate Republicans doubled down and stuck to their position. Since then, the term constitutional crisis has been very much in vogue and put forth to describe lots of different things. Here's Time magazine. It's just a week before the election, telling us that constitutional crisis because whoever wins the election, America has become ungovernable because of the rift between red staters and blue staters, Democrats and Republicans. You have during the course of the election Donald Trump, who says that if you elect Hillary Clinton, you'll end up with a constitutional crisis because she's crooked Hillary, and she won't be able to govern. There's going to be all sorts of incidents if she becomes president. After Trump wins, the ACLU runs an ad calling Trump a one-man constitutional crisis because of all of the various things he'd promised to do as president. And then there are lots of specific incidents around and out of the new administration after it takes office that are said to involve a constitutional crisis. So just a few of these. There was, you might remember, the emoluments clause issue. So Trump owning lots of hotels and property around the nation and around the world, and he's saying, don't worry, there's no potential for a conflict because my kids are going to run everything for me. This gets described as a looming constitutional crisis. There was soon after that the trademark issue. So suddenly China is approving lots of pending trademark applications for the Trump brand in Chinese markets, raising concerns about foreign affairs and private gain being intermingled. Right, constitutional crisis. You had the executive orders concerning immigration, a little bit of activity on that front the last couple of days. And the courts initially blocking them, and President Trump criticizing the so-called judges. And a question whether the administration will abide by the judges' rulings, right, with the possibility, again, of a constitutional crisis. The firing of FBI Director Comey, right? Is this a constitutional crisis? Yes, says David Cole in the New York Review of Books. Worse than that, this is Senator Schatz from Hawaii. It's a full-blown constitutional crisis. You get Hollywood stars weighing in on this, right? Writing a letter to the Senate saying that you've got to do something in order to avert the constitutional crisis that resulted from the Comey firing. And then speculation about who else might be fired, and concern or thoughts about Special Counsel Robert Mueller, right, that Trump is flirting with another constitutional crisis by thinking about firing Mueller. Then maybe Sessions is next, right, because they sort of fell out of favor. Sessions might be next. That would be a constitutional crisis. Some suggestions was back in July that we're already at the point of a constitutional crisis because Trump at that point was saying mean things about the Attorney General. I understand they've since reconciled. The pardon of Joe Arpaio, the Arizona sheriff, constitutional crisis. Speculation that if things involving Russia lead to an indictment of the president, he would just pardon himself, and that would trigger another constitutional crisis. There were lots of other incidents as well, along with the sort of general claims that the whole presidency is destined to be a constitutional crisis at some point or another. Okay. Well, one thing that should be clear is that the use of the term constitutional crisis in these various contexts has been quite loose. It's used frequently without much of an explanation about what counts as a crisis of constitutional magnitude. Sometimes the phrase seems to mean just an intense political conflict, sometimes that we think the Constitution is being violated or ignored, sometimes that the Constitution itself falls short, doesn't provide a remedy for a political problem, sometimes just that I disagree so intensely with what the government is doing that I'm going to label it a constitutional crisis for extra effect. Now I said there's an uptick in the use of the term constitutional crisis right right after the death of Justice Scalia. But before moving on, I don't want to create the impression that this is just a new term or this is sort of Trump-related issue. There are various incidents in our history that have been discussed previously as involving a constitutional crisis. Just to give you a few examples, the 2000 election, the Supreme Court's decision in Bush versus Gore, impeachment of Bill Clinton in 1998, Nixon and Watergate in the 1970s. I'm going to come back to that towards the end of the talk. Roosevelt's court packing plan in the 1930s, struggle over slavery, secession, the Civil War as a constitutional crisis. But earlier, Andrew Jackson's showdown with the Bank of the United States in 1832, Sedition Act of 1798. So lots of historical incidents that can be recast or cast as involving a constitutional crisis. It's not a Trump-specific term. It's also not a term that is just limited to the United States. It gets a lot of use outside of the United States today. So just two examples that have been in the news recently. There's a current constitutional crisis in Australia because there's this curious provision of the Australian Constitution that says you're not allowed to serve in the Parliament if you owe allegiance to some other country. So you have to be an Australian citizen, but if you owe allegiance to some other country, you cannot serve in the Australian Parliament. And all of these individuals have been discovering that there are other countries out there that consider them citizens, right, of that country because the parent was born in New Zealand, or maybe they were born somewhere but never thought that they were a citizen of that country. And they've had to resign as a result. There's been this wave of resignations as a result of the fact that other countries consider these individual citizens. This has triggered what is being discussed in the media there as a constitutional crisis. The looming constitutional crisis in Spain, with Catalonia moving ahead with a referendum on independence that the central government does not favor and is likely to intervene to stop. This is described in the Spanish press also as a constitutional crisis. Right, so it's not a Trump-related term uniquely, and it's not a U.S. term uniquely either, but there is at least very frequent use of the term constitutional crisis to describe our current political environment. Now, the risk is that if you keep saying constitutional crisis, sooner or later people stop paying attention to your warning, right? Everything starts sounding like a constitutional crisis, and we stop paying attention. And in particular, life has gone on, right, since all of these various constitutional crises that have allegedly been occurring over the last 12 months or so. So to go back to where we started, the Scalia vacancy was filled by this guy, Neil Gorsuch. So that crisis seems to have been resolved, not in the way the Democrats would have liked, but it seems to have been resolved. Perhaps it's still there, and maybe the impact won't be felt until the next seat opens up, right? These people don't live forever. And so maybe next time around, we'll see something more dramatic. I don't know who these are, but I thought it was a good slide. More dramatic in the Senate as a result, right? This is the crisis coming back with respect to the next appointment. But the court is, for now, up and running, and so at least that crisis has been averted for the present. The other risk of labeling a whole series of incidents as involving a constitutional crisis is that doing so may obscure a more subtle development, what we might call constitutional decay or erosion. This is where there's just a kind of slow breakdown of the normal institutions, the rules, procedures, norms, expectations. So you don't really notice what is happening. And then one day you see that your foundations have cracked, the pillars of your system of government are falling, not because of any single dramatic incident, but because of developments over a period of time that are not particularly notable when they actually occur. Those are actually the Dead Sea Scrolls. But so it might be useful to temper the use of constitutional crisis, reserve it for truly extraordinary incidents. And along those lines, Jack Bolkin, Sandy Levinson, two law professors, friends of this institution, say that a constitutional crisis is only where there is a serious danger that the Constitution will fail at its task of keeping disagreement within the bounds of ordinary politics, instead of breaking down into lawlessness, anarchy, violence. Right? So secession and the resulting civil war, yes, that's really a constitutional crisis, but these other Trump-related incidents do not rise to that level. So that might be a better use of the term constitutional crisis. I would like to push things a little bit further. Everyone who talks about constitutional crisis, whether in a broad, loose sense or a narrow sense, takes for granted that the form of government is a constitutional system of government in roughly the shape that we know it. That is to say that even though a crisis might require a change in the details, the basic structure, a constitutional system, will remain in place at the end. And that's the idea that I would like to challenge and suggest to you that it's not just the details that are in play, it's the very form of government itself that is not inevitable that constitutional government will endure. And when I say that, by constitutional government, I mean just in the sense that you probably already think about it. The sort of key aspects, foundational aspects, you have set of government institutions with defined, limited powers, protections for individual rights, and you have democracy in a thick sense. So there's meaningful voting along with democratic institutions that protect voting, protect fair elections, freedom of speech, the press, other sorts of things that we associate with modern democracies. That's a constitutional democracy. Plenty of variation in terms of how you set things up in individual systems, but it's that system of government that is not, I would like to suggest, inevitable. And I want to use the second concept, crisis of constitutionalism, to talk about that issue. And I want to talk historically, globally first, and then bring things back to the United States. So as the 20th century closed, there was a strong sense that debates over the form of government that would exist, should exist, were settled in favor of constitutional democracy, or what you might call liberal democracy, liberal in the sort of traditional sense, classic sense. And all that was left was a sort of final cleanup in the parts of the world where constitutional democracy had not yet taken hold, but that was only a matter of time. The great struggles of human history over the form of government had come to an end. There were strong reasons for this conclusion. In what's often called the third wave of democracy from the mid-1970s through the early 1990s, the number of constitutional democracies in the world sharply increased. And in particular, you get constitutional democracies in Latin America in the 1980s, in the Asia-Pacific region, Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, from 1986 to 1988, in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, and then going into the 90s in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a rapid global increase in the phenomenon of constitutional democracies. You go from 30 constitutional democracies in the mid-1970s to over 100 as the century closes. The precise number depends a bit on your definition. There's adoption essentially throughout the world of written constitutions providing for democratic government. Constitutional democracy seemed, as the century closed, inevitable everywhere. 2 decades later, that assessment has turned out to be at least premature and perhaps just wrong. So first, no continued progression occurred. We did not get constitutional democracies in all 190-odd countries of the world. That earlier sharp upward trajectory came to a halt. Second, in many authoritarian countries, the grip has become tighter, more daring, and I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. And then third, perhaps of most significance, there's been backsliding, a move away from constitutional democracy in places where it had taken root. So that we actually have today about 24 fewer constitutional democracies than existed at the turn of the century. Turkey, Thailand, Botswana, Hungary are among the countries that have actually reversed course. Okay, let's be a bit more specific and take up some examples to demonstrate the trend. So first, China and Russia. China's 20% of the world's population, Russia about another 2%, both big economies, influential on the world stage. Neither is a constitutional democracy. As for China, as the century closed, many people thought that constitutional democracy would soon arrive in China. And the theory was that democracy went hand in hand with market-based economic growth. This hasn't happened. Instead, China has demonstrated that authoritarian rule is actually compatible with economic development. In China, you have a single-party system. It has little tolerance for political opposition or dissent, poor human rights record, and it appears that so long as the ruling party continues to deliver economic growth, it's going to be able to stay safely in power. And then two additional points about China and really concerning the present. The first is that the communist regime under President Xi Jinping has been tightening up its control. You've had very recently the adoption of new laws and regulations on cybersecurity, internet activity, strict regulations of foreign nonprofits, of religious groups, heavy sentences handed down to human rights lawyers, activists, and dissenters. The president has been busy consolidating his own power over that of party elites, and this is new. There's a renewed insistence on ideological conformity and a requirement of party loyalty, along with renewed criticism of Western-style democracy. There are now plans in China for a social credit system that gives everyone a sort of numerical rating of their behavior and trustworthiness with consequences for employment and so on. You thought FICO was scary. China's also tightened its hold on Hong Kong with, for example, recent interference in the composition of the legislature there. And then because of an unfortunate resemblance, you're also not allowed to talk about Winnie the Pooh in China. He's banned. The second point is you have new influence by China beyond its borders. China's development banks play a key role now in Africa, Central Asia, Latin America, providing billions of dollars in economic aid. And in contrast to the World Bank and other institutions, China does not condition aid on democratic reform, but instead it adheres to notions of respect for diversity in the form that government takes, so that a key tool that helped explain the prior rise of democracies is blunted, because a lot of the money going into development originates with China without these sorts of conditions attached and without oversight of the growth of democratic institutions. Briefly, with respect to Russia, you have power consolidated in the hands of President Putin, suppression of political opposition, manipulation of parliamentary and parliamentary and regional elections. You have new laws that target so-called extremist websites, various kinds of civic organizations that deem NGOs to be operating as foreign agents. Russia has also evidently embarked on a program of interference with elections in established democracies. And then elsewhere in the world, we see similar tales of similarly bleak tales. So you remember the Arab Spring, right, in late 2010, early 2011, right, this very optimistic period. But besides Tunisia, constitutional democracy did not take hold. As a result, instead you had dictators replaced essentially by autocrats. In Egypt, where expectations were particularly high, you had this kind of thing to get rid of President Mubarak in January of 2011. You end up with this guy, General Sisi, who seizes power in a military coup in 2013 and uses the military and the security apparatus to go after opponents and troublemakers, increased use of torture, military trials, people disappearing, and so on, and similar failures of constitutional democracy out of the Arab Spring elsewhere in that region. Turning to Europe, Hungary and Poland are the significant countries here. In Central Europe, we saw in the 90s the overthrow of totalitarian governments and the rise of democratic institutions. But in both Hungary and Poland, after efforts to implement parliamentary systems failed, we have ended up instead with presidential autocracies, with the remarkable result that within the European Union, you now have countries that are not constitutional democracies, and you also can't get rid of them because of the way that the European Union is set up. Hungary, you have election in 2010 of Prime Minister Viktor Orban. this guy, and his ruling Fidesz party. They rewrite the constitution to consolidate power. They essentially take over the courts. They get rid of media outlets and civic entities that are critical of the government. Poland takes roughly the same path in 2015 with the Law and Justice Party. And this guy, Jarosław Kaczynski, coming to power. They've been busy enacting laws to control the media, limit the powers of the Constitutional Court, new and draconian surveillance measures, limits on protests and so on, as Hungary and Poland, but other countries in Europe to watch as well. The big news yesterday from the elections out of Germany is not that Angela Merkel came back, was returned to power as expected, but that the nationalist, populist Alternative for Germany party won a large number of seats in the parliament. And then switching to think about other places in the world, the Philippines, you have this guy, President Rodrigo Duterte, elected in 2016. He's popular for being tough on crime, which in his case means shooting drug dealers and other suspected criminals. Several thousand of these executions to date. In his campaign for president, he promised his presidency would be a bloody one. But don't worry, he would issue, quote, 1,000 pardons a day to police and soldiers accused of human rights abuses, and would also issue a presidential pardon to himself for mass murder at the end of his term. Venezuela, you have this guy, Hugo Chavez, becomes president in 1998. In his inaugural speech in January of 99, he calls for a political revolution so that he can tackle the country's social and economic problems. In violation of the existing constitution, he convenes a constituent assembly to write a new constitution. The assembly, made up of Chavez's friends, dissolves the democratically elected Congress, dismisses the members of the Supreme Court and the lower courts, gets rid of the Attorney General, replaces everyone with Chavez supporters, all under his exclusive command. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, you have this guy, President Joseph Kabila, delaying constitutionally mandated elections so he can stay in office after his term expired back in December of 2016. After protests break out, they met with government violence. Nobody quite knows when or if this guy is actually going to leave. In Thailand, the military seizes power in a coup in 2014 with this guy, General Prayut, in charge, calls itself the National Council for Peace and Order, and then adopts a series of laws that prevent any kind of opposition, forces through a new constitution under which, among other things, the parliament is, as a matter of the constitution, to be dominated by the military. There have been repeated promises for elections in Thailand. They're now scheduled for sometime in 2018. We'll see if they occur. There are other examples of countries reversing course, but I don't have all day. Perhaps you think, well, things don't always move forward quickly. Maybe it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but we're basically on the right path. There is, though, I think, more than that going on. Globally, we see not just a slowing down of the movement towards constitutional democracy, but also a change in the form that the alternatives are taking and a self-conscious celebration by them that they represent legitimately different systems of government. So a few features of what I would call the new authoritarians to flag, right, to watch for. One is the phenomenon of the single leader controlling all of the offices of government. So the whole system of government is personalized with requirements of personal loyalty, leader over party, leader over country, and the sense that the leader has great personal powers and has arrived to take us in the right direction at this point in history. So the Philippines under Rodrigo Duterte, Russia under Putin, Syria under al-Assad, Turkey under Erdogan, Zimbabwe under Mugabe, Hungary under Orban are examples of this. But then second, you also have elections. Modern authoritarian systems tend to hold elections, eventually, as a basis for claiming legitimacy. So that leaders have been elected and re-elected, and in contrast to past systems where you rigged elections by only giving people the choice of one candidate, modern authoritarian countries, the new authoritarians, allow for multiple parties, opposition candidates, but the process is very tightly controlled. So you have election laws that favor the incumbent, your regulation the campaign process, control of the media, restrictions on the activities of opponents, repeal of term limits and other sorts of devices designed to ensure turnover, various forms of disenfranchisement, special rules about voting by immigrants or expats, strategic timing of elections, whole series of devices so that you can ensure what the outcome is going to be. So there is this kind of veneer of democracy, sometimes a very thick veneer, but the use of sophisticated tools that manage electoral outcomes. Third feature is populism. So authoritarian leaders today rely on populism. Populism is an appeal to the will of the people as a basis for rule, for legitimacy. It sounds great, but it has a slightly darker side. It often invokes a revolutionary tradition, therefore grounds itself in notions of self-government, progress, throwing away the chains of oppression, and so on. Populism depicts political insiders, political careers as serving their own rather than the people's interests. Political opponents get depicted as enemies of the people, right, rather than representing a legitimately alternative position. Populism constructs a single identifiable the people of the nation, and you are either in or out. There's no middle ground. There's no space for notions of pluralism or diversity or disagreement. In addition, populism insists that limits upon direct and immediate rule by the people, things like legislative processes or judicial review, are corruptions because they get in the way of raw majoritarian preferences and programs. Individual rights are problematic because they create artificial divisions among the people as sovereign and undermine the interests of the collectivity. So here's Viktor Orban from Hungary in 2014, talking about the Hungarian nation as being not just a sum of individuals, but a community that needs to be organized, strengthened, and developed. And the embrace of Hungary as in the speech, an illiberal state, right? A self-conscious embrace of that with limits on individual rights in the name of the community. Of special concern is any sort of reliance upon human rights and requirements or standards from beyond the nation state, such as in treaties or the decisions of international tribunals. Those are all to be resisted because by definition they lack national legitimacy because they do not reflect the will of the people of the state. And then a fourth feature is an interesting reliance upon courts. Courts have been made tools of the regimes. They've had their powers trimmed, their memberships changed, size altered so as to allow for court packing. We've seen all of these things in Hungary and Poland and elsewhere. And then the use of the courts to help consolidate and hold power. Favorable decisions by the Russian Constitutional Court have been extremely helpful to President Putin in Russia. But you also have some number of adverse judgments against the regime. These regimes tolerate some rulings against them, because then you could say we have judicial review by independent judges, even though at the end of the day, on the whole, the judges are in your pocket. And then a fifth feature, you do have written constitutions that protect individual rights. And they often invoke provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So they look very good, but they're often built-in limits on the scope of rights. So for example, built in the Constitution are limits on rights so that they exist only to the extent they're compatible with the interests of the society, with the well-being of the state, or vaguely defined national values. Or rights on paper might not be very strong in practice. So freedom of speech, for example, might be restricted in practice because of control of the media. And one tool in particular that has emerged is the use of very strong defamation laws so that you can sue your critics out of existence rather than, as in the past, having to lock them up. All right? And then the last feature is this invocation, and we saw it in the Orban speech just a moment ago, of diversity among systems, celebration of differences, right, among systems of government, this sort of self-conscious embrace, right, of our system as an illiberal state, right, rather than what other countries have, and pride in this as a legitimate alternative form of government, alternative to sort of traditional constitutional democracy. Okay. Let's come back to the United States. Now, some speakers at this point would put up a slide with Trump, right, and say, and Trump's just another one of these people. But that's not where this talk is headed. You can think about whether these sorts of developments have any domestic relevance or resonance. I want to give you just quickly an additional bit of information. And the basic point here, we've talked a lot about sort of the structures of government. The point here is that public support for constitutional democracy is also on the decline. And I have a few slides to show you, but hopefully you can see them. This is a good one. So this is by cohorts, right? Recent survey by cohorts, and look at the United States in particular. So the percentage of people who say it's essential to live in a democracy. Look at the people who were born in the 1980s, right? Only 20-something percent, 26% say that it's essential to live in a democracy, whereas earlier generations in the U.S. as high as 75%. So it's a cohort effect. This is based on the World Values Survey, which has been asking these sorts of questions for many, many years. Then second slide, and again, you can focus on the United States. This one asks whether having a democratic political system is bad or a very bad way of governing the country. And again, over 20%, if we look at the last column, of millennials say, yes, I agree with that, right? It's a bad way of governing the country. Those are cohort effects. You can also look at developments since the 1990s, and these are really notable. So here, here the question is, instead of having a legislature and elections, how about we just have a strong leader, right, running everything? And this extraordinary number, more than 40% of those born in the 80s, that's the decade, say, yes, I like that, in the United States. And there are other sorts of figures as well, including you ask people, do you think it would be a good idea for the army to rule? And 1 in 6 Americans today say yes, versus much smaller numbers from the 90s. Rich people, in particular, have changed their views about the value of democracy. It used to be that the wealthiest segments were the ones who favored it. Poor people did not. That's completely flipped now in the United States. All right, so that's what I think of as the crisis of constitutionalism, represented by the forms of government we see today increasingly taking hold, and this kind of support for alternative arrangements, right, very skepticism among the public of constitutional democracy itself. Okay, everything I've said has been descriptive. I haven't given you much in the way of causes that I've of what I've described. There's no normative spin. I haven't said whether these developments are good or bad, and I haven't specified, and I'm not planning to specify any remedies. But if you're interested in understanding this crisis of constitutionalism, explaining it, or maybe intervening, then legal training seems to me especially useful. Now, it's true that in some countries you have power that's just seized through brute force, but elsewhere the developments situate themselves in the law, right? So remember the pictures of the guys who are not wearing military uniforms. They're wearing suits. They get elected to these positions. And they use legal tools to manipulate politics so they can stay in power. They appeal to law as a basis for legitimacy. They rely on courts to sustain them. They invoke well-established legal principles like sovereignty and self-rule, all right, as a basis for putting in place alternative arrangements to constitutional democratic systems. The law is everywhere in this, and this means being trained in the law can be a real asset in making sense of, keeping an eye on, playing a role in contemporary politics and political development, whether you are talking about the world or things that are happening at home. And here I think the model is Bert Jenner. He was the true citizen lawyer, the kind that's often in short supply today. From all of the accounts I've read, and I've been reading a great deal about him recently, he was a highly regarded professional, trustworthy, diligent, somebody who, though, put principle above party and politics, deeply committed to the immediate client or cause, but very much concerned also with the rule of law and the path the country was on. Vic had mentioned some of the roles that Bert Jenner played throughout his life, both in private practice and in public service. You don't get to do all of those things if you do not command widespread respect. I found a statement by another friend of the University of Illinois, U.S. District Judge Prentice Marshall, speaking of the time that Bert Jenner died in 1988. He said he was a great advisor, advocate, and public servant. No person contributed more to the legal profession and the administration of justice than he. In this respect, Watergate is an especially interesting and a good place to end. So just briefly to remind you what happens. As the Watergate scandal heats up in the summer of 1973, there are calls for President Nixon's impeachment. In the winter of 73, the House Judiciary Committee, to which had been referred 24 proposed articles of impeachment, forms a staff. It's known as the Impeachment Inquiry Staff, and separate from the regular committee staffers, to look into the charges against Nixon. John Doerr is named lead special counsel on the staff, and in January of 1974, Albert Jenner is appointed by the Republicans to be the chief minority counsel. Doerr had been assistant general for civil rights in the Kennedy administration. He had Republican support as a nonpartisan professional. Jenner, in turn, had the support of Democrats. In fact, he was initially offered the position as lead special counsel. This was a different era. Hillary Rodham, then a 26-year-old law graduate, was also a member of the inquiry staff. And I might also note here that Ronald Rotunda, who was the Albert E. Jenner Jr. professor here from 1993 to 2002, served as assistant majority counsel to the Senate Watergate Committee, so sort of the Senate counterpart to the inquiry staff. I don't know about my immediate predecessor, John Colombo, but he sure has served in a lot of roles, so I wouldn't be surprised. The inquiry staff spends 8 months essentially gathering evidence, sorting out the constitutional standards for impeachment, because there's not a whole lot to go on. And the staff's work is the basis for the Judiciary Committee's vote in favor of 3 articles of impeachment in the summer of 1974 and Nixon's resignation. The inquiry staff operated as a nonpartisan body, right? Not bipartisan, nonpartisan. You can only do that because of a shared commitment on the part of John Doerr and Albert Jenner to follow the evidence wherever it took them, to determine the proper constitutional standards, and to apply those standards to the facts as they developed. Under that approach, Jenner joined the recommendation that Nixon should be impeached. With that, according to reports that I read at the time in the Washington Post, Nixon, never going down without a fight, pressured House Republicans to remove Jenner from his role. Jenner gets replaced in late July 1974, but he gets renamed Senior Associate Special Counsel to John Doerr. So he continues working on the inquiry staff. And of course, the jig is up, and Nixon resigns a few weeks later on August 9th. After I graduated from law school, I was a law clerk to Robert Sack, as Vic had mentioned, on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Judge Sack had for many years, I was one of his first set of law clerks. He had just been appointed to the bench by President Clinton. Judge Sack had for many years been a prominent First Amendment lawyer. And his joke with me was that I'll take care of the First Amendment, you're responsible for everything else. Before becoming a First Amendment lawyer, though, Judge Sack served as Senior Associate Special Counsel, working alongside Bert Jenner. He contacted me when he got wind of this. He called it a canonization rather than investiture. He got wind of this and said how delighted he was that sort of these two spheres of his professional life over the course of his career could come together at this point in time. He, not surprisingly, speaks very highly of Bert Jenner. Said to me that he's a very good lawyer and a very good man. The kind of person you'd want to have around in a crisis. And that's him testifying in Burt Jenner testifying before the House. So that seems like a good place to end with just a quick footnote. And the footnote is the following. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a conference and I was perhaps prematurely using my new title. And when it came time for the conference organizers to introduce me before I was giving my speech, the person referred to me as the Albert E. Jenner Junior Professor at the University of Illinois. I didn't say anything at the time, I'm too polite, but later I like that because it suggests that there's a senior professor version of me still to come and who may have some things to say, and I hope you might be interested at that point in hearing the rest of the story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. That was a characteristically wonderfully crafted presentation, parts of which were delightful to hear, and other parts of which not so much. We do look forward to you continuing to grow in this role. I don't know that we have a separate Jenner Professorship to confer on you, but we certainly commend you on your past achievements, and we look forward to celebrating your future contributions, not just to the College of Law, but to the Academy and to society more generally. So congratulations once again.
Thank you.